5 years after his wife passed away, a billionaire came to her grave to pay his respects. But he didn't expect to see a child sitting there crying. And that child called his wife Mom. The late November air in New York tasted like metal and memory, sharp, cold, and heavy with things unsaid. The wind pushed softly through the towering black gates of Westfield Memorial Cemetery, nudging dried golden leaves across the stone paths and whispering against old names etched in marble. It was a quiet kind of place, reserved not only for the dead, but for the moments the living weren't ready to speak out loud. Ethan Graves arrived just after 3. Right on time. He always was. His car, a sleek black Porsche, rolled to a near-silent stop beside the empty gravel path, and for a moment he didn't move. The engine died. The world went still. He stared ahead through the windshield as if expecting something to change, the trees to part, the earth to shift, or the pain in his chest to finally let go. But it didn't. It never did. He opened the door and stepped out slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his wool coat with practiced grace. There was no entourage, no cameras, no assistant shadowing his every move. He came here alone every year, always alone. To the world, Ethan Graves was precision and power in human form, the mind behind Helix One Technologies, a billionaire tech visionary whose ambition had redefined how society communicated, worked, and even thought. But here, among the rows of names and dates, he was just a man in mourning. Just a husband who came every year to visit a grave that bore more weight than any title or empire. She had been gone for 5 years. Her name was Amelia. Even now, the sound of her name in his thoughts felt like glass underfoot. Sharp, fragile, impossible to avoid. He moved down the winding path, past headstones worn smooth by time and weather, past memories that didn't belong to him. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the low whistle of wind brushing through skeletal trees. Each step toward her grave felt both familiar and unbearable, like revisiting a wound that never healed but refusing to let the scar disappear. She had died quietly. That was what he remembered most. No drama, no bitterness, just the quiet slipping away of a soul too good for the world that had broken her. Cancer, they'd said, aggressive, unfair, unstoppable. But Amelia had handled it like everything else, with grace that humbled even him. They'd met in a bookstore, the one thing in Ethan's life that hadn't been planned. She was thumbing through a volume of Neruda poems, and he had made some dry remark about poetry being inefficient communication. She'd smiled without looking up and said, "That's what makes it beautiful." He'd fallen in love with her. That day, he never stopped. Now he knelt before her grave each November, his breath forming little clouds in the cold, his heart still asking the same question. Why her? Why not me? He turned the corner, her grave just ahead, under the oak tree that dropped its leaves as if in mourning too. But then he stopped. Someone was already there. A small figure sat on the ground, arms wrapped around thin knees, a backpack at his side and a too big hoodie pulled tight against the cold. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7. His sneakers were muddy, his jeans torn at the cuff. He was entirely alone. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He had specifically chosen this part of the cemetery because it was private, isolated. The grave itself was set in a section of land he had purchased in full. No other burials, no other names. He paid for silence. But now a child sat at the foot of the gravestone he visited religiously, as if he belonged there. The boy didn't look up. Ethan took a step closer, his brows furrowed. "Hey kid," he said, keeping his voice calm but direct. "Are you lost?" The boy turned slowly, and Ethan stopped breathing. It wasn't just the eyes, it was everything. The shape of his mouth, the soft jawline, the way his hair curled at the ends. He looked like her. The boy shook his head. "No, I'm not lost." Ethan stepped closer. "What are you doing here?" The boy hesitated, then pointed to the gravestone. "I came to see my mom." Ethan's stomach dropped. His body went cold, as if the wind had found a way into his bloodstream. "What did you say?" "My mom," the boy repeated, his voice quiet but clear. "Her name was Amelia. Amelia Rose. I come here every year. Miss Natalie says this is where she's sleeping now." Ethan stared at him, his mind scrambling for logic, for reason, for anything that made sense. "You knew her?" The boy nodded. "She used to visit me, at the shelter. She brought books. She read to me. She smelled like flowers and she always smiled. I didn't know she was my mom at first, but Miss Natalie told me when I got older." Ethan felt dizzy. He had to kneel to keep the world from tilting. "What's your name?" "Caleb," the boy said. "And your last name?" "Moore, I think. That's what it says on my stuff. Caleb Moore." The name meant nothing to Ethan. No records, no memories. But those eyes, those haunting, familiar eyes, held pieces of Amelia he thought had died with her. "She never had a child," Ethan murmured. "We never—" He stopped himself. He wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore. Caleb himself? Amelia? "She left me when I was a baby," Caleb said. "Miss Natalie said she had to, that she wanted to keep me, but she couldn't. But she came back sometimes, not always, but enough that I remember." The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded paper, a drawing, crude but clearly done with care. It was of a woman and a little boy standing under a tree, stars drawn all around them in dark blue ink. She said the stars were where wishes went when you didn't know how to say them out loud. Ethan stared at the drawing, then at the boy, and something inside him broke. He had lost Amelia once, and now standing in front of this grave, a child was unraveling the truth he never imagined existed, that she hadn't just been his wife. She had been someone's mother, and she had never told him. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and dialed. "Damien," he said as soon as the line picked up. "There's a boy here, at Amelia's grave. His name is Caleb Moore. He says she was his mother. I need you to find out everything, where he came from, who his father is, if there are records, anything." "On it," Damien said. "You okay?" Ethan hung up without answering. He turned back to Caleb. The boy was standing now, watching him with something like trust in his eyes. Not certainty, but hope. "Where do you live?" "At the shelter, St. Maribel's, in Brooklyn." "Do you want to go back now?" The boy nodded. "Come on," Ethan said quietly. "I'll take you." The ride was silent, but not awkward. Ethan drove carefully, his knuckles pale around the steering wheel. He wasn't used to children in his car. He wasn't used to not knowing what came next. Caleb sat in the passenger seat like he had done it before, calm, still, eyes fixed. On the window as the city passed them by in a blur of grey and lights. "She used to hum," Caleb said after a while. "Not real songs, just sounds, I remember that." Ethan's eyes burned. "She used to do that when she cooked," he said. "I always thought it meant she was happy." They pulled into the lot behind the shelter. Caleb unbuckled himself and reached for the door handle. But then he paused. "Will I see you again?" Ethan stared at him. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know anything. But his voice found its way through the tangle of thoughts. "Yes," he said. "You will." Caleb nodded and got out. He turned once, halfway to the door, and smiled. It was Amelia's smile. Then he was gone. Ethan stayed in the car until long after the boy had disappeared inside. He didn't know who he was in that moment. Not the CEO, not the grieving husband, not even the man who had survived loss. He was just someone standing at the edge of a truth so big, so life-altering, it took his breath away. Somewhere Amelia had left behind a secret, a boy, a piece of herself. And now that boy had found his way back, not by accident, but by something that felt bigger than both of them. Ethan wasn't sure what came next, but he knew this. He couldn't walk away. Not from the truth, not from Caleb, and not from the chance, however broken, however late, to choose love again. The city didn't feel the same on the drive back. Ethan Graves sat behind the wheel of his Porsche, barely hearing the low hum of the engine or the quiet whir of passing traffic. The skyline towered over him as it always had, but tonight it didn't feel like home. It felt like a wall, a series of glass towers built by a man who suddenly didn't know who he was. He had built his life in clean lines and cold logic, and yet all of it now felt like paper held up to fire. Nothing about what had just happened at Amelia's grave made sense. The boy Caleb couldn't have been lying. Not with those eyes, not with that face. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. The quiet way he had brushed the leaves off her name. The way he said Mom like he'd been waiting years for someone to ask him if he remembered. Ethan had spent his whole life making decisions. Quickly, based on information, risk, reward. But nothing in this moment allowed him to calculate his way forward. He was driving through the city not as a CEO, not as a man in control, but as someone lost in grief for a woman he had loved, and confused by a boy who looked too much like her to be a coincidence. The next morning, Ethan sat in his study with a black coffee growing cold beside him. His assistant had already called twice, his phone lit up with texts from his legal team, and the board wanted updates on the Brazil acquisition. But none of that mattered now. Not when the image of Caleb was still burned into his mind like sunlight on snow. Amelia. What had she done? What had she kept from him? He had replayed their final months together 1,000 times since she died. She had grown, quiet toward the end, thoughtful, sometimes distant. He'd assumed it was the pain, the treatment, the weight of knowing she wouldn't see another spring. But now he wondered, had it been guilt? Was this what she was carrying all along? Ethan picked up his phone and called Damien Ross, the one, man he trusted to go deep, find answers no one else could. Damien answered on the second ring. I'm already working on it, he said without preamble. There's not much. The name's Caleb Moore. He's registered with the city as a ward of the state. No known next of kin. He's lived at St. Maribel's since he was a newborn. And the mother? Ethan asked. Hold on, Damien said, tapping keys. Birth certificate lists the mother as Amelia Rose Rains. No father listed, no legal. Documents attached. But there's something interesting. You were married to her under the name Graves. Rains was her maiden name. She used it to keep him hidden, Ethan said aloud, the words bitter in his throat. Damien paused. It looks that way. Ethan hung up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows in his living room. Below, the city moved like it always had, unbothered, efficient, indifferent. He had built a life where he didn't have to feel the chaos beneath the surface. But now that chaos had come knocking in the form of a 7-year-old child who called the woman he loved Mom. Ethan grabbed his coat, stepped into the cold, and drove back to the shelter. St. Maribel's wasn't in a part of the city he ever visited. The building was old, brick worn thin by years of storms and footsteps, its windows fogged from heat inside. He parked, stepped through the door, and into a world far from the marble and steel he lived in. A woman at the front desk looked up, startled. Can I help you? I'm looking for Caleb Moore, he said. He's a resident here. She narrowed her eyes. And you are? He handed her a business card. Ethan Graves. Her eyes widened. The Ethan Graves? Yes. One moment. She disappeared down a hallway and returned with a second woman, older, kind eyes, hands weathered by time. I'm Joan, she said. I run the program here. You're here about Caleb? Ethan nodded. He came to my wife's grave yesterday. He said she was his mother. Joan's expression changed, not surprise, but resignation. She folded her hands. I was wondering when you'd come. They sat in a cramped office that smelled of old books and hand sanitizer. Joan looked across at him, her voice steady. Amelia came to me 7 years ago. She had a baby in her arms and tears in her eyes. She told me she couldn't raise him. Said the man she loved couldn't know. Said it would destroy him. Ethan's throat went dry. She was talking. About me. Yes, Joan said. I figured that out later. I recognized her face on the news. But I made her a promise. I wouldn't contact you. I wouldn't tell you unless something happened to her. Why would she do that? Ethan asked. Why would she hide a child from me? Joan leaned forward. She said she didn't want Caleb to be raised out of obligation. She was afraid you'd take him out of guilt, or because it was the right thing to do. She didn't want your love for her to be turned into resentment for him. She was wrong, Ethan said. You might not have been ready then. Joan replied gently. But are you ready now? That night Ethan sat in silence beside Amelia's photograph. He remembered her laugh, her quiet strength, the way she used to rest her head on his shoulder in the minutes before sleep. He remembered the softness in her eyes when they spoke about children, how she used to say, maybe someday, when the world feels quieter. He never realized that day had come and gone without him knowing. The next morning, Ethan returned to the shelter, not with questions, but with an answer. He asked Joan what it would take for him to become Caleb's guardian. She gave him a list. Ethan called his lawyers. He began the process. For the first time in years, his days felt full of something real. He took Caleb out for lunch, for books, for long walks where they didn't speak much but stayed close. Caleb was quiet, always observing. He didn't ask for much. He didn't smile easily. But sometimes when they sat side by side at the planetarium, Ethan would glance over and catch the boy looking at the stars with a kind of wonder that didn't need words. One night, Caleb fell asleep on the couch, a book open on his chest. Ethan stood watching him, wondering how a life so small could carry so much weight. He didn't know how to be a father, but he knew how to stay, how to listen, how to choose someone every single day. He began preparing his home, a real room. Books, clothes, a telescope by the window, a picture of Amelia that Caleb had picked out himself. And when the court date came, Ethan stood with his hands steady and his voice clear. "I want to give him a home," he said to the judge. "I don't know what that means yet, but I know he belongs somewhere he's wanted, and I want him." The judge granted temporary guardianship. 90 days. Ethan walked out of the courthouse with Caleb beside him, and for the first time since Amelia died, he didn't feel alone. That night they stood on the rooftop of the penthouse, staring up at the stars. Caleb looked up. "Do you think she can see us?" Ethan nodded. She always could. And in the quiet that followed, something passed between them. Something unspoken. Something permanent. Not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes that's the stronger bond. The first few weeks passed in a way that neither Ethan Graves nor Caleb could fully define. There was no script for what they were becoming. No clear roadmap for how a billionaire who had long believed he'd lost everything suddenly found himself building something entirely different, entirely human, with a quiet boy who spoke rarely, but watched everything. At first, the changes in Ethan's penthouse were subtle. An extra toothbrush appeared beside his own. A small stack of worn library books began to accumulate on the marble counter. A jacket 2 sizes too small hung from one of the hooks near the front door. Crooked, unclaimed by the order Ethan used to demand. His world had once operated like clockwork, every minute accounted for, every object curated. But now the silence was filled with the sound of child-sized footsteps padding across hardwood floors, the occasional rustle of pages being turned in. Another room, and even soft humming when Caleb believed no one was listening. Ethan noticed these details like a man learning to see again. He hadn't yet told many people. Not his board, not his investors. Only his lawyer and his assistant Rebecca, who handled the paperwork and kept his schedule flexible while asking. Almost nothing in return. She didn't pry, but she observed. And one afternoon, while dropping off documents, she lingered a moment longer than usual, watching Caleb quietly sketch constellations at the breakfast table. She turned to Ethan and said, "You look different." He didn't reply, because she was right. He felt it too. Caleb was adjusting slowly, cautiously, like a traveler unsure whether the road ahead was real or another illusion. He asked small questions in the evenings, questions about the city, about the stars, about Ethan's childhood. Ethan didn't lie when he admitted his childhood had been far less magical, more focused on discipline and expectations. He didn't grow up tracing stars or naming galaxies, but somehow hearing about them from Caleb made him wish he had. The boy had a way of seeing things that reminded Ethan painfully of Amelia. It wasn't just his face or the freckles dusted across his cheeks. It was the way he paused before he spoke, how he chose words with care, how he carried his solitude not as a shield but like a quiet truth he had accepted long ago. Some nights, Ethan would find him standing near the windows, gazing at the city like it might speak if he listened long enough. One evening, after a quiet dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, Caleb surprised Ethan by saying, "I don't dream very much." Ethan looked up. "No?" Caleb shook his head. "But when I do, it's always the same. It's my mom. She's walking ahead of me and I'm trying to catch up, but I can never reach her. She doesn't turn around." Ethan swallowed something, sharp in his throat. "Maybe she knew you were strong enough to find your way." Caleb didn't reply. He just nodded slowly, accepting the idea with the gravity of someone far older than his age. The following weekend, Ethan took Caleb shopping. He didn't know what kids needed. Not really. His idea of preparing for a child had been hiring decorators and calling in an architect to build out a suitable bedroom wing. But it turned out Caleb didn't want wings. He wanted books, a globe, a pair of noise-cancelling headphones for the subway, and a soft blue hoodie he refused to take off even when indoors. The staff at the department store stared a little, recognizing Ethan, but he ignored them. He wasn't there as a CEO. He was there because the boy beside him had finally smiled, really smiled, while trying on sneakers that lit up when he walked. At home, Ethan made it a point to join Caleb in small things. They built a bookshelf together. It was uneven, slightly crooked, but Caleb said it was perfect. They assembled a telescope on the balcony and spent nights mapping the stars. Caleb taught Ethan constellations and how to trace the shape of a myth in a sky full of silence. On one of those nights, Caleb turned to him and asked, "Do you think she knew about all these stars before she died?" Ethan nodded. She knew the stories. She used to say the stars helped her remember who she was before the world got loud. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Maybe that's why I like them. They're quiet too." Meanwhile, the legal process advanced. Damien, true to his word, had dug deeper into Amelia's past. One afternoon, he arrived at Ethan's office with a manila envelope in hand, the expression on his face unreadable. "You need to see this," he said. Ethan opened the folder slowly. Inside was a photocopy of a sealed hospital record dated 8 years earlier. A paternity test request never completed, filed under the name Amelia Rose Rains. The name of the alleged father was left blank, but notes scribbled in the margins mentioned a referral to a Dr. Henry Moore, a pediatrician. Damien explained that Henry Moore had died in a car accident 5 years ago. No wife, no children, no surviving family. He was listed as Caleb's emergency, contact only once during an infant checkup, and then nothing, no follow-up, no confirmation. Ethan stared at the papers. "So Caleb has no other family?" "No one on record," Damien said. "That boy is alone, except for you." Ethan sat with that knowledge for a long time. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed, he poured himself a drink and walked into the study. Amelia's photograph was there on the bookshelf, the one she had sent him in the first year of their marriage. In it, she was laughing, windblown, with the sea behind her. He remembered taking that photo. He remembered her reaching for his hand right after, saying, "Promise me, no matter what happens, you won't lose the part of you that sees beauty in small things." He hadn't understood then what she meant. He was always chasing the next deal, the next innovation. But now, watching Caleb sleep, his hand curled under his cheek like a question waiting to be answered, Ethan thought maybe this was what she'd meant. Maybe she hadn't left him with a void, but with a gift he wasn't ready to receive until now. The next morning, Ethan did something he never expected. He stayed home from work. Not for a crisis, not for a merger, but because Caleb asked if they could spend the day just walking. They walked through Central Park, stopping at a small museum exhibit on constellations, and then sat by the pond where Caleb fed breadcrumbs to birds and ducks. "Do you think she'd like it here?" Caleb asked. Ethan looked around. "She would have loved it." Caleb smiled, then looked at the sky again. "She always said people don't disappear when they die. They become part of the world that keeps going, like a song you can't hear but still feel." Ethan's throat tightened. She was right. When they returned home, a letter was waiting in the mail. A court notification. A date had been set for the guardianship hearing. Ethan stared at it, fingers pressed to the edge of the envelope, and for the first time the weight didn't scare him. He knew what he wanted. He knew what was right. That night, he told Caleb, "There's a hearing next week. A judge will decide whether I can become your guardian permanently." Caleb looked up from his book. "Does that mean I'll stay?" "If you want to," Ethan said. Caleb nodded. "I do." The day of the hearing arrived with cold wind and gray skies. Ethan wore a charcoal suit, the one he used for high-stakes negotiations. But this wasn't about leverage. It was about love. They sat before the judge in a small, quiet room. The judge was kind, observant, and asked Ethan directly, "Why are you pursuing guardianship?" Ethan's answer was simple. "Because I didn't know about him before, but now I do. And I'm not the kind of man who walks away from the people he loves." The judge asked Caleb, "Do you want to stay with Mr. Graves?" Caleb looked up with those steady ancient eyes and said, "He remembers her too." The judge approved the request. Ethan Graves became Caleb's legal guardian. As they stepped into the lobby, sunlight broke through the clouds outside. Caleb squeezed Ethan's hand and said, "Does this mean I get to stay forever?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "It means you're home." That evening, back at the penthouse, Ethan stood on the balcony while Caleb slept. He stared at the stars, remembering the first time he saw Amelia in that bookstore. Remembering how the world had changed when she entered it, and how even in death she had somehow given him a second chance. Not just at love, but at life. Behind him, the sound of a soft laugh echoed from Caleb's room as he dreamed. Ethan didn't know what tomorrow held, or the day after that, but he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was the boy who had once waited in silence at a grave, hoping someone might finally see him. Now someone had, and it changed everything. Spring came early to the city that year, and with it came a softness Ethan Graves hadn't felt in years. The ice that once layered his mornings, the coldness in his chest, the stiffness in his posture began to melt, though he barely noticed it at first. But others did. Rebecca, his longtime assistant, mentioned offhandedly one morning, "You've been smiling more lately." It wasn't an observation. It was a quiet acknowledgement, the kind people make when they've watched someone carry grief for too long and are finally beginning to see cracks of light return through the walls. But Ethan wasn't smiling for appearances, and it wasn't a product of strategy or design. It was Caleb. It was the way that boy slowly colored in the spaces Ethan had believed would remain forever gray. Each morning began with small things. A second cup set on the counter, cereal boxes next to imported coffee, shoes left near the entryway, a science book open on the couch. These weren't disruptions. They were signs of life. And for a man who had once built his world to run with machine-like precision, Ethan found himself welcoming the gentle chaos that Caleb brought. After the court formalized his guardianship, the paperwork filed and signed, something inside Ethan shifted. There was a certainty now, not in title or legality, but in presence. Caleb wasn't just visiting anymore. He belonged. He wasn't a guest in Ethan's life. He was part of its architecture. And Ethan, without ever saying it aloud, knew his purpose had changed. The man who had once chased headlines and balance sheets now chased after laughter down long hallways, reading bedtime stories beneath the dim light of the room Amelia had once dreamed of turning into a nursery. The room was now Caleb's. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. There was a telescope by the window, a star map taped beside the bed, and shelves lined with everything from comic books to worn copies of Carl Sagan's work. On the nightstand sat a photo of Amelia, one Caleb had chosen himself from a drawer of old memories. He had placed it gently, as if giving her permission to stay. One night, just as Ethan was about to turn off the lights, Caleb spoke into the darkness. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "She'd be proud of you every single day." "What about you?" Caleb asked. "Do you think you're who she hoped you'd be?" The question landed heavy, not because it was accusatory, but because it came from a place so honest that Ethan couldn't offer anything less than the truth. "I think I spent years being someone who tried to earn love by being perfect," Ethan said. "And now I'm trying to be someone who loves by showing up. Every day, no matter what." Caleb didn't respond, but he smiled in the dark. Weekends became their time to build, explore, and be together without the pressure of routine. They went to bookstores and left with more than they needed. They took walks through Central Park where Caleb would invent names for trees and squirrels and tell stories about how stars were born from the wishes of kids who never stopped believing. Ethan listened to every word. He learned to slow down, to kneel in the dirt beside Caleb and trace imaginary constellations with a stick in the mud, not caring about the suit he'd forgotten to change out of. There were also questions. Caleb had begun to ask more about Amelia, about who she had been before he was born, what she loved, how she laughed. Ethan found that talking about her no longer twisted like a blade. It felt more like watering something buried, coaxing it back to bloom. He shared stories Caleb had never heard, including the one about how Amelia once convinced him to dance in the rain during a thunderstorm, wearing their finest clothes because, in her words, even the sky has to cry sometimes. It was on a quiet Wednesday morning with the spring sun cutting through kitchen windows that something unexpected arrived. A letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting delicate. There was no return address, but Ethan recognized it instantly. It was Amelia's. The shelter had forwarded it, delayed in its discovery, buried in boxes meant for closure. He opened it slowly, unfolding the paper like it might vanish in his hands. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the world went on without me, and somehow you found him. I don't know how or when or what version of you is sitting with this letter, but I know you. I know your heart even when you don't show it to anyone else. I need to say I'm sorry. For the silence, for the space I didn't know how to fill. I wanted to tell you, so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I handed you something this heavy, it would break the very thing we built together. I had so much love in me, Ethan. More than I knew what to do with." Caleb came into this world during a time when everything felt uncertain, And I made a decision I thought would protect you both. I wasn't brave enough to believe you could love us both the way we needed. That's not your fault. That was mine. If you've chosen him, if you've made a home with him, then I was right to trust you even when I couldn't ask you. Thank you for loving him, for forgiving me, for being the kind of man who doesn't turn away from what hurts. He's so much like you, you know. In the way he sees the world, in the way he waits for people to prove they won't leave. Please, Ethan, keep showing him they won't. Love always. Emilia. Ethan sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. Then he folded it, not to hide it, but to preserve it. He would give it to Caleb one day, but not yet. Some words needed to be saved for the right moment. Later that evening, Caleb found him standing on the balcony, watching the light shift over the city. "You okay?" he asked. Ethan turned. "Yeah, just thinking about her." Caleb stood beside him. "I think about her every day." "Me too," Ethan said, "even when I try not to." "Is that bad?" "No," Ethan replied. "It just means she mattered." That night they sat on the floor of the living room playing a board game neither of them understood, laughing at the rules they kept getting wrong. Caleb leaned back at one point and looked around the apartment. "It's different now," he said. "The house?" Ethan asked. "Yeah. It feels warmer, like she left something behind and we just turned the lights back on." Ethan reached over and ruffled his hair. "Maybe that something is you." Caleb grinned. "Maybe it's us," and it was. It was both of them, two people bound not by biology, but by the quiet courage of beginning again, by the act of choosing each other day after day, by the willingness to believe that even love written in grief could still find its way home. Summer arrived in quiet waves, not with noise but with warmth, the kind of warmth that settles into your skin rather than demands to be noticed. It was the first summer in years that didn't carry the familiar ache for Ethan Graves, the empty space beside him in bed, the untouched chair across from him. At breakfast, the sound of Amelia's voice echoing in memories only he could hear. Something had changed. Not because she was any less missed, but because her absence was no longer a void. It had become something else entirely, something woven into every corner of the life he was slowly building with Caleb. Caleb had grown in ways that weren't always visible to the eye, but you could feel them. In the way he walked into rooms, with a little more confidence, in the way he started leaving his bedroom door open while he slept, in the way he laughed without checking first to see if it was okay. He had stopped asking if he was staying. He no longer counted days. He stopped wondering when Ethan might send him back. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, forged in the steady rhythm of ordinary things, the packing of lunches, the walks home from school, the nights spent identifying constellations. Through the telescope they now shared. There were still hard days, nights when Caleb would wake up from dreams he couldn't quite explain, moments when silence would fall heavy in the air and Ethan wouldn't push. Instead, he'd sit beside him, wordless but present, letting the boy know he wasn't alone. That presence, that consistency, had become their language. It was how they said "I love you" without ever needing to say the words. Ethan had learned that fatherhood was not a role you stepped into. It was a relationship you built one small moment at a time. It was showing up even when you didn't know how. It was listening when there was nothing to say. It was choosing them over and over, not because you had to, but because you couldn't imagine not doing it. It was in the way he started keeping Caleb's drawings pinned above his desk at work, in how he always made it home by dinner time now, no matter the meeting, in the way he found himself studying planets and moon phases just so he could answer questions that mattered deeply to a child who had once taught himself the universe to feel closer to a mother he never truly knew. One day, while going through an old box labeled Amelia's Things, they found a notebook, her handwriting soft and familiar across its pages. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense. There were no dates or entries, just bits of poetry, thoughts jotted down. During train rides, observations about life. Caleb read one aloud, his voice slow, reverent. "Sometimes I think the sky holds the things we're too afraid to say." He looked up. "She wrote that." Ethan nodded, eyes stinging. "She always understood the weight of silence." They made it a tradition after that. Every Friday evening, they read one page together. Some pages made them laugh. Some made them pause. Some made Ethan weep quietly once Caleb had gone to bed. but all of them made them feel closer to the woman who had brought them together even in her absence. By the time the school year ended, Caleb had transformed in ways Ethan hadn't fully realized until one afternoon in early June when he picked him up from the final day of school. Caleb came bounding down the steps, waving a certificate in his hand. "I got the science award," he said breathlessly. "And Mrs. Callahan said I should think about the science fair next year." Ethan crouched beside him. "You're amazing, Caleb." The boy beamed. "I want to build a model of the Mars rover. Do you think we could work on it together?" Ethan didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely." And in that moment, as they walked to the car, talking about wheels and solar panels and miniature mechanics, Ethan realized something he hadn't been able to name before. He wasn't parenting out of guilt anymore, or responsibility, or memory. He was parenting from joy, from choice, from love. That summer they traveled, not far, just places Ethan had always promised himself he'd go but never found time for. Coastal towns with quiet beaches, forests with observatories tucked into hills, a cabin with no internet where they read by lantern light and played cards by the window. Caleb kept a travel journal. He drew everything, the shape of trees, the position of stars, even Ethan's expression while he tried to cook over a fire and failed spectacularly. On one page, Caleb wrote, "This is the first time I've ever seen my whole life at once, not just pieces, but all of it together." Ethan didn't say anything when he read that line. He just hugged the boy a little tighter that night before bed. As September neared, Ethan made a quiet decision. He filed the paperwork to formally adopt Caleb. It wasn't required. Legally, he was already the boy's guardian. But something about the act felt necessary, not for appearances, but for permanence. He wanted the world to know what he already felt in his bones. That Caleb was his son. That Amelia hadn't just left a memory behind. She had entrusted Ethan with her most precious gift. When he told Caleb, the boy didn't say anything at first. He just stared, wide-eyed. Then he whispered, "I don't have to stop being her son, right?" "You'll always be her son," Ethan said. "But you'll be mine too." Caleb's voice trembled. "Do I get to pick a new name?" Ethan smiled. "You can, or you can keep yours, whatever you want." Caleb thought for a long moment, then said, "Can I have both of your names?" And so he became Caleb James Graves. The day the adoption became official, Ethan took him to the same grave where their story began. The cemetery was quieter than usual. The oak tree nearby had begun to shed early. Caleb carried a small stone. In his palm, the kind he used to collect as a child, painted now with stars and the word home written across the center. He knelt and placed it gently at the base of Amelia's headstone. "I still think about you every night," he whispered. "But I'm okay now. He makes it okay." Ethan stood a few feet away, giving him space, but when Caleb turned and reached for his hand, he stepped forward. Together they stood in silence, not heavy, not broken, but whole. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was saying goodbye. He felt like he was saying thank you. The years that followed were not perfect. There were hard moments. There were arguments over curfews and science projects that failed, and days when Caleb shut down and didn't want to talk. But there were also nights spent building model rockets, and weekend trips to hidden bookstores and stargazing in the backyard until 2 a.m. Ethan was there for every fall, every win, every heartbreak, every triumph. He was there when Caleb graduated high school with honors. He was there when he got accepted into a university astronomy program. He was there when Caleb turned 21 and gave him a card that simply read, "Thanks for choosing me every day." And one day, years later, Caleb stood at a podium, giving a speech at an awards banquet for young scientists. He was confident now, articulate, wiser than most people twice his age. In the middle of his speech, he paused and looked out at the audience. "When I was little," he said, "I used to think that love was something you either got or didn't, that some people were just born into it. But I learned that love isn't always loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone who sits beside you when you're scared, someone who shows up without needing to be asked, someone who holds your hand at a gravesite and helps you believe the world still holds good things. I didn't find my family the usual way, but I found him. Or maybe he found me. Either way, I'm here because of that love." In the front row, Ethan felt tears fill his eyes, not from pride, but from something deeper, something sacred. When the evening ended, they walked out into the night. The stars above were faint through the city lights, but they both looked up anyway. I think she would have loved this, Caleb said. I think she's still here, Ethan replied. I think she never really left. They stood there a while longer side by side, no longer billionaire and orphan, no longer man and boy, bound by grief, but father and son, bound by the kind of love that survives death, reinvents itself through choice, and becomes a home not built by blood, but by hope. And somewhere above them, the sky kept spinning, quiet, infinite, and full, of the stars they'd spent a lifetime learning how to name together.